Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace.
So today I'm going to show you how to very easily share information by means of a blog post. I've already got the blog set up on the website, and you're hopefully going to listen to this video about battleship generations, plus hopefully you've listened to the one about World War II torpedoes already. So as you can see, we can insert all sorts of things, but at this point I'm just going to put the text of my proposed battleship definitions in there. But then I'm going to put in another block, another text block, and this is going to allow you to download the spreadsheet that contains all of the different battleship classes, or at least most of them. So just upload, you can see you can attach a URL link, or very easily just go to File. There's the file, it's an Excel file in case you're wondering. And then it's time for the spreadsheet on torpedoes. So I'm going to put in some text for linking for that. But then I decided, oh, you know what, hang on a minute. After I've actually linked that file, I don't think it sits there quite nicely. So I'm going to put a spacer in, and then I'm going to put an image in, and you can do that retroactively, as you can see, if you think you need something in between sections on the blog. So it's all done. That's ready to go. You can go look at it on the website now, download those spreadsheets if you want.
So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show.
Right, so when it comes to battleships, at least when you're looking at the early 1890s onwards, you'll often hear ships divided up into four broad categories: pre-dreadnoughts, dreadnoughts, super-dreadnoughts, and fast battleships. Now, this is a useful shorthand for approximate time periods, largely thanks to the Washington Naval Treaty, but it can, and does, lead to quite a few grey areas and some somewhat unreasonable comparisons in certain cases. After all, under this system, the USS Texas and the USS Colorado are technically both super-dreadnoughts, as are HMS Orion and HMS Nelson. Yet it is obvious that there is a world of difference in lethality between each of those pairs. Likewise, the King George V of 1930s vintage, the USS North Carolina, and the Yamato are all put into the same box. You also have the problem of ships that admittedly were perhaps not commissioned, but were seriously designed and in some cases at least partially constructed. So where, for example, does a 1920s South Dakota sit? It's not a fast battleship. It's definitely not fast by any stretch of the imagination, for one thing, which would technically make it, under the current system, a super-dreadnought. But a comparison of that thing with Texas or Orion is even more absurd than the comparison of those two with Colorado or Nelson, but somehow we are supposed to accept that these are all super-dreadnoughts. The existence of grey areas where one type starts to bleed into another also lands us with some people using the term semi-dreadnought for a small batch of ships that are realistically far too powerful to be lumped in with the main group of pre-dreadnoughts, but they're also clearly a step below almost any dreadnought. And so, after some thinking on the subject a little while back, I began to devise my own, slightly more granular classification system in my head. You may have heard me make reference to this in previous videos. This uses 7 overall categorizations, and of those it splits 5 of them into first and second generation subcategories, thus giving you 12. I think this splits up ships, primarily dreadnoughts and later, into admittedly a few more categories, but I think it groups them far better by overall capabilities and time period. And so under this system, if you were to think of a ship, the system would place that ship fairly easily among contemporaries and ships with approximately similar capabilities, rather than giving you the absurdity of trying to match an N3 against a Britannia. And thus, I would like to present you with Drax's 12-point battleship classification system. In order, this goes first generation pre-dreadnoughts, second generation pre-dreadnoughts, semi-dreadnoughts, first generation dreadnoughts and second generation dreadnoughts, first generation super dreadnoughts and second generation super dreadnoughts, what I've termed first and then second generation Washington battleships, although you could call these post-World War I battleships or something similar, mostly because mega or hyper dreadnoughts seems a bit silly. This is then followed by a pair that don't involve first and second generation, treaty battleships and treaty period battleships, although I'm open to suggestions for a pair of names for that might be a little less confusing, followed by our last generation, the post-treaty battleships. And you'll be glad to know that each section is defined by a series of qualifications, although said qualifications do get a little bit simpler as you go forward in time. So, let's go through them one at a time. We'll look at some examples of the classes that are included in each generation, and then you can tell me in the comments below whether you agree, or if you slightly disagree, what particular qualifications you might change for each generation. And to be honest, to a certain extent, the more extensive list of qualifications in the earlier generations is largely down to the sheer number of battleships that need classification in that period. Anyway, first generation pre-dreadnoughts should have steel armour, either Harvey or regular nickel steel, a high freeboard relative to preceding ironclad or compound armoured ships. Generally, they will carry guns with a 30 to 35 caliber length, although where I use the term generally, there may be one or two rare exceptions. Again, generally, they will have 4 main guns, and usually these will be in a pair of twin turrets, one fore and one aft, but of course some doctrines, such as the French, might have those 4 guns distributed in other manners. And the main gun caliber should be 11 inches or above unless they are specifically noted as second class or some other diminutive form of battleship. So for the Royal Navy, that would be the Majestic and Canopus classes. For the US Navy, Texas, Indiana class, Iowa, Kearsarge class, Illinois class. For the French, Bouvet and that whole fleet of experiments, Charlemagne, Iéna, and Suffren. For the Germans, Kaiser Friedrich III and the Wittelsbachs. For the Italians, the Ammiraglio di Saint-Bon. There's also the Renown, the second-class battleship for the Royal Navy. The Austro-Hungarians would have the Habsburg and the Erzherzog Karl pre-dreadnoughts. The Russians have a whole list of them because they built most of them singly, but essentially Devenetsats Apostolov all the way through to Peresvet, I think. You've got things like Navarin, Rotislav, Sisoy Veliki, Petropavlovsk, and Trisvetatelia, I think. Navarin as well. And for the Japanese, Fuji and Shikishima. And I'm sure there's a few others out there as well. We then come on to second generation pre-dreadnoughts. These should have Krupp steel, maintain a high freeboard, have 40 caliber guns or longer, reflecting advances in firepower technology. Again, generally should have 4 main guns in a pair of twin turrets, one fore and one aft, with 1 or 2 exceptions, and their main gun caliber should also be 11 inches or above. This means that second generation pre-dreadnoughts would include the formidable London, Duncan, and King Edward VII classes in the Royal Navy, the Maine, Virginia, Connecticut, and Mississippi classes in the US, the Republik and Liberté types for the French, the Braunschweig and Deutschland classes for the Germans, the Regina Margherita for the Italians, the Potemkin, Redzvizan, Cesarevich, Borodino, Evstavi, and Andrei Pervozani classes or singles for the Russians, and Asahi, Mikasa, and Katori types for the Japanese. You'll be glad to know the lists get a lot shorter after this period. You then move on to semi-dreadnoughts. These should have a large number, 8 or more, of secondary guns of 8-inch caliber or greater. There should be no further secondary armament that has a primary doctrinal role for engaging capital ships, i.e. below this they should have only anti-torpedo boat weapons. And their main gun caliber, of course, is still 11 inches or above. So this results in the three most common suspects for being semi-dreadnoughts, the Lord Nelson class, the Danton class, and the Satsuma class, but also covers the Austro-Hungarian Radzecki class and the Italian Regina Elena class, largely on the basis of that impressive secondary battery. Then we move on to first-generation dreadnoughts. These should have a main gun caliber of 11 or 12 inches, with 8 to 10 main guns, which can be fired in either an 8 or 10 gun broadside. Their secondary battery should be primarily designed for anti-torpedo boat work. They may or may not have wing or en-echelon turrets, and they can utilize either turbine or vertical triple expansion engine propulsion. So this would give you Dreadnought, St. Vincent, Bellerophon, Neptune, and Colossus. So yes, the entire 12-inch lineup of the Royal Navy falls under first generation. South Carolina, Florida, and Delaware in the US. The Corbeils for the French. The Españas for the Spanish. The Minas Gerais for the Brazilians. The Kawachis for the Japanese. Nassau, Helgoland, Kaiser, and König for the Germans. A second generation dreadnought would have a main gun caliber of 12 inches, should have at least 12 main guns, and should be able to fire those in a full broadside, which means they should either have no wing or en-echelon mounts, or if they do have en-echelon mounts, these should be able to fire over quite a broad arc rather than the very limited arc more typical of the type. And generally speaking, they should have turbine propulsion, although one or two exceptions might be made. So, second generation dreadnoughts would be the Wyoming class for the Americans, the Dante Alighieri, Cavour, and Duilio classes for the Italians, the Gangut and its derivative designs for the Russians, the Tegethoff in Austria-Hungary, and the Rivadavia and Agincourt, obviously Rivadavia being a class and Agincourt being a solo ship, for the Argentinians, and Agincourt, there is various ownerships, but eventually ending up in the Royal Navy. That brings us on to first generation super dreadnoughts. This is a fairly simple one. They should have a main gun caliber that's somewhere between 13 and 14 inches, and they should have 8 to 10 main guns. This gives us a list of the Orions, the World War I era King George V's, and the Iron Dukes for the British, the New York class for the Americans, as well as the Nevadas, the Britannias for the French, Almirante Latorre for the Chileans, Erin for the British, although technically it was originally supposed to be Turkish, and in terms of uncompleted designs, the Ersatz Monarch class for the Austro-Hungarians. Second generation super dreadnoughts look for main guns with a caliber of 13 to 15 inches, but if you have a 14-inch or under armament, you should have at least 12 guns, or if you've got a 15-inch armament, then of course you can go with 8. So this would mean that there would be the Queen Elizabeth and Revenge class is in this category for the British, the Fusos and Isseis for the Japanese, the Pennsylvanias, New Mexicos, and Tennessees for the Americans, the Baden or Bayern class for the Germans, and in terms of uncompleted but partially built designs, the Francesco Caracciolo and Normandy classes for the Italians and French respectively would also fall into this category. Then we have what I've tentatively labelled first generation Washington battleships, although as I say that is a title that's open to change of terminology, with a categorization of having 16-inch guns and having 8 or 9 of those guns, with a displacement up to around 35,000 tons. So in this category, you essentially have 3 ships, or 3 classes, the Colorados, Nagatos, and Nelsons. Then we move into second generation Washington era battleships. These have either 16 or 18-inch guns. If they have 16-inch guns, they should have at least 10 of them, and if they have 18-inch guns, they should have at least 8 of them, and of course their displacement is going to be over 35,000 tons. This is the only category where none of them were actually ever completed. So it would include the 1920s version of the South Dakota class, the N3 for the British, obviously the South Dakotas are American, the Tosa, Key, and number 13 classes for the Japanese. And yes, this does technically mean we've left the Leon class of the French Navy without a specific classification. I suppose you could maybe stick it into second-gen super dreadnoughts, but it's a real mess of a design anyway. And then we move forward almost a decade and a half to the start of the treaty battleship era. These should have a speed of 27 knots or greater, a standard displacement of around about 35,000 tons or less. Generally speaking, they should be armed with 14 to 16-inch guns, although a few smaller calibers can also be accepted. And, of course, they would be built under the Washington Naval Treaty and expanded London Naval Treaty restrictions. So this would include the King George V 1930s edition, the North Carolinas, the 1930s South Dakotas, the French Richelieu and Dunkirk classes, and if you want, you can probably include the Scharnhorsts as well. Then you have a very small categorization of treaty period battleships, which are battleships built during the period of the Washington and London Naval Treaty restrictions, but that have a displacement significantly in excess of 35,000 tons, but also where the powers in question tried to pretend that those ships were roughly adhering to the 35,000 ton limit. And this only has actually 2 entries that were actually built, the Bismarck class and the Littorio class, although there are quite a number of other design studies which would also fall into this categorization. And then we have our final class, the post-treaty battleships, which would be ships built or potentially planned without the 35,000 ton limit in mind, either through escalator clauses or flat out ignoring the treaties, or potentially not even being part of them in the first place, and quite specifically also not claiming to adhere to the displacement limit as well. So this would include the Iowas, the Yamatos, HMS Vanguard, and then in terms of ships that were not completed, the Lion class, the Montana class, the Super Yamato class, the H-39s, the Alsace class, and the Sovietsky Soyuz class. So that's my proposal. If you can think of a slightly better set of names for first and second generation Washington-era battleships, or a better pair for treaty and treaty period battleships, let me know. If you think a slightly different classification system should be used, again, let me know. If you'd like to add or delete points from each of those bullet points for each section, again, comments below. Or if you think one or more battleship classes should be moved around within the classifications that I just gave, again, let us know. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on this particular issue. And as per the beginning, if you want to look over all of those classification systems without having to listen back to the video again and again, there is now an article on my website where you can read everything at your leisure.